By 6:40 that evening, the county's rescue crane was buried to its axles in black Missouri mud, its warning lights flashing uselessly against the rain. A medical transport van sat 30 yards beyond it, tilted hard toward a ditch, with 2 patients inside and the road crumbling under every wheel that touched it. The engineers had already tried mats, cables, winches, and orders shouted over radios. Then Caleb Rusk stepped out of the tree line with 2 old mules and a cracked leather harness everybody in Hollow Bend had laughed at for years. Caleb was 79, a retired teamster with hands bent by arthritis and boots that never looked clean. To the county men, he was a leftover from a time of wooden sleds, feed sacks, and stubborn animals. His mule harness hung in his barn like a museum piece nobody wanted, patched with copper wire and fitted with small brass tags worn almost smooth. Nolan Vance, the rescue engineer, told him to stay back. Caleb only looked at the sinking crane and said, "You're pulling against the mud. You have to pull with it." The deputies laughed first. Then the younger road workers followed. Even Caleb's neighbor shook his head, embarrassed for him. But the rain kept falling. The van kept sinking. And on the left breast strap of that old harness, under 60 years of grime, was a line of numbers that would not just change the rescue. It would reopen the night Caleb's father died in disgrace. So why had an old man guarded a mule harness as if it were evidence? If stories about forgotten skills, old promises, and people the world was too quick to dismiss mean something to you, consider subscribing. Because what happened on that muddy road was not just about a rescue. It was about a truth that had waited 60 years to be pulled free. Yellow tape snapped in the rain at the edge of Mercy Ridge Road, and every man behind it acted as if the tape itself could hold back the hillside. Floodlights leaned over the ditch. Radio voices cracked in and out. The medical transport van sat crooked beyond the county crane, its rear wheels buried deep, its front bumper pointed toward sycamore roots showing through the washed-out bank. Inside were 2 patients from the low side of Hollow Bend. One was Mr. Pruitt, a dialysis patient, thin as kindling under a gray blanket. The other was a woman recovering from surgery, while her daughter stood behind the tape with both hands pressed over her mouth. Nolan Vance moved like a man trying to outrun panic. He was 38, county certified, and dressed in a yellow rain shell that still looked new. His crew had laid traction mats, set a cable line, repositioned the crane, and argued over ground pressure until the words meant less than the rain. "We pull from the shoulder," Nolan shouted. "Slow tension, no jerks." Caleb Rusk stood 20 feet behind the deputies with Amos and Bell, his 2 gray mules, waiting quietly under the dripping branches. He had not come because anyone called him. Nobody called Caleb unless a fence gate stuck, a county fair wagon needed moving, or some child wanted to pet an animal his parents called obsolete. He had come because he knew that road. He knew how the clay changed below the first bend. He knew where water slid under the gravel instead of over it. And from the way the crane's rear tire had sunk on the left side, he knew Nolan was not pulling a van out of mud. He was pulling the mud down with it. "Let me rig from the sycamore," Caleb said. Deputy Lyle Boone turned first. He looked at the mules, then at the cracked harness over Caleb's shoulder, and gave a short laugh. "You serious?" Nolan heard him and came over, rain running off his hard hat. "Mr. Rusk, this is an active rescue scene. I can see that. Then you can see why I need you behind the tape." Caleb did not raise his voice. "Your line is too high. Your mat is floating. You keep pulling straight. That van will swing before it rises." A road worker snorted. Someone muttered, "Here we go." Caleb saw Willis Crane, his neighbor, near a county pickup, shaking his head as though Caleb had walked into church wearing muddy boots. Emergency Director Marla Keene stepped beside Nolan with a clipboard against her chest. "We are not putting animals on a county rescue site," she said, "especially not with cameras across the road." "There are people inside that van," Caleb said. "That is exactly why we are using trained personnel." The words landed hard, but Caleb had lived long enough to know that insult often wore a clean coat. He looked past her at the van. The woman's daughter was crying now. One of the paramedics knocked on the rear glass and gave a hand signal Caleb did not understand, but Nolan did. His face tightened. "Pressure's dropping," the paramedic called. Nolan turned back to his crew. "Reset the line. We try again." Caleb moved one step closer to the tape. Sheriff Wade Mallory blocked him with one hand, not rough, but firm. Wade was nearly Caleb's age, with eyes that always seemed to know more than his mouth allowed. "Go home, Caleb," Wade said quietly. Caleb looked down at the sheriff's hand. "You remember East Draw?" Wade's face changed before he could stop it. For 1 second, the rain, the radios, and Nolan's shouting seemed to fall away. Then Wade pulled his hand back. "Don't bring that up here," the sheriff said. But Caleb already had. He shifted the harness on his shoulder, and one small brass tag slid out from beneath a cracked leather strap. Deputy Boone saw it and smirked. "What's that, old man? Decoration?" Caleb covered the tag with his thumb. Nolan's crew tightened the crane cable. The engine groaned. Mud bubbled around the buried tires. The van moved an inch, then two, and for a heartbeat everyone leaned forward as if hope had finally found a hook. Then, the right rear wheel dropped. The van tilted harder toward the ditch. The woman inside screamed. Nolan shouted for slack, but the cable had already bitten deep into the clay. Caleb closed his eyes. In his mind, he heard his father's voice as clear as rain on a tin roof. "Mud don't fight strength, son. It follows pressure." When Caleb opened his eyes, Nolan Vance was no longer looking at the crane. He was looking at the old man with the mules. Caleb Rusk had learned mud before he learned numbers. His first school had not been the white clapboard building beside Hollow Bend Church, though his mother made him attend it every fall with his hair combed flat and his shirt buttoned to the throat. His first school had been the low pasture behind his father's barn, where Missouri clay held wagon wheels the way a fist held anger. Jonah Rusk taught him there, not with lectures. Jonah was not a man who wasted words when a rope, a wheel rut, or a mule's ear could explain the world better. He would stand in the wet ground with one hand resting on a leather line, watching the mud breathe around a stuck wagon. "Look before you pull," he would say. Caleb, 8 years old and thin as a rail, would squint at the ruts. "Wheels buried," he would answer. Jonah would shake his head. "That's what happened, not why." Then he would point to the shine of water on one side, the darker clay under the other, the way grass bent downhill, the way bubbles rose where weight had squeezed air from the soil. To Jonah, mud was not an enemy. It was a witness. It told a man where pressure had gone and where it wanted to go next. That was what made Jonah Rusk known across 3 counties before 1957. Farmers called him when loaded hay wagons sank in spring fields. The sawmill called him when timber skids slid sideways down wet banks. Once, when a school wagon broke a front axle in a storm, Jonah came with 2 mules and a sled and brought 6 children home before dark. People trusted him then. They trusted his quiet eyes, his broad hands, his mules, his harness, and the strange patience he had around danger. Jonah never rushed a pull. He would walk the ground first, test it with his heel, kneel sometimes, and press clay between his fingers. Men laughed about that until their wagons came free. Then they stopped laughing and paid him in cash, feed, smoked ham, or repairs to the barn roof. Caleb grew up proud of him. The mule harness hung on the cleanest peg in the barn even back then. It was heavy, dark brown, and always smelled of leather oil, sweat, rain, and the faint mineral scent of old brass. Jonah never threw straps on the ground. He laid them across the rail as if they could bruise. He wiped the buckles after every job. He taught Caleb to run a thumb along the stitching and feel for weakness before the weakness turned into a break. "Gear fails quiet before it fails loud," Jonah said. That was another sentence Caleb carried longer than he understood. His mother, Elsie, used to watch from the kitchen window while father and son worked in the yard. She was a small woman with flour on her hands and a sadness behind her smile even before the flood came. She would call them in when supper cooled, and Jonah would pretend not to hear until Caleb laughed. Those were the years Caleb remembered when he wanted to remember kindly. Then came East Draw. The rain began on a Tuesday and did not behave like rain after that. It came hard, then harder, then sideways, turning ditches into streams and streams into brown moving walls. By Thursday, the low road past East Draw had vanished underwater. Families who lived along the draw packed what they could onto wagons and pickups, but the clay roads softened too fast. The county sent deputies. The church bell rang twice before dawn. Men moved with lanterns in water up to their knees. Jonah harnessed Amos's sire and Bell's dam before daylight. Caleb was 10. He remembered standing in the barn doorway, barefoot despite his mother's shouting, watching his father tighten the breast straps with the careful hands of a man going to work, not war. "Can I come?" Caleb asked. Jonah looked at him then. Not stern. Not gentle either. Just long enough that Caleb felt something important passing between them. Not this time. Elsie wrapped her shawl tighter around herself. Jonah. He kissed her once on the forehead. Then he took the team down the flooded road. For years after, Caleb had only broken pieces of that night. A lantern swinging in rain. A deputy's truck at sunrise. His mother sitting at the kitchen table without moving. A wagon wheel in the yard, with river grass tangled in the spokes. And his father coming home after noon, soaked through, one sleeve torn, mud up to his chest, and his face so empty Caleb was afraid to touch him. At first, people came to the house with questions. Then they came with silence. Then they stopped coming. 3 days after the flood, the county report was posted outside the courthouse and printed in the Hollow Bend Gazette. Caleb did not understand all the words, but he understood his mother's hand tightening around the paper. The report said Jonah Rusk abandoned a rescue route near East Draw. It said he diverted his team to recover a supply wagon while 3 families remained stranded beyond the flooded crossing. It said by the time county crews returned, the water had risen too high. It did not call Jonah a coward. It did not need to. Hollow Bend did that part for them. At church, men stopped asking Jonah to help with wagons. At the feed store, voices lowered when he walked in. Boys at school asked Caleb if his father saved flour sacks while people drowned. One teacher told the class that bad judgment in a crisis could stain a family name for generations, then looked too quickly away from Caleb's desk. Jonah never defended himself. That was what hurt Caleb most. He waited for his father to march to the courthouse. He waited for him to knock a man down. He waited for him to say the report lied, to show proof, to tell the town what really happened in the dark water of East Draw. But Jonah only worked. He mended fences. He oiled the harness. He fed the mules. He grew quieter every year until silence seemed less like something he chose and more like something he had been sentenced to carry. Sometimes, late at night, Caleb heard his parents speaking in the kitchen. "Tell him," Elsie whispered once. Jonah answered so softly Caleb had to hold his breath to hear. "Not until he knows how to read it." Read what? Caleb never found out. When Jonah died, he did not die in a flood or under a wagon or in any way that sounded like the life he had lived. He died in winter, in the same bed where fever had taken half the strength from him before dawn. Caleb was 32 by then, old enough to have left Hollow Bend twice and come back both times because his mother needed him and because anger did not always carry a man as far as he thought it would. Jonah asked for the harness before he died. Caleb brought it from the barn, confused and frightened, and laid it across the quilt. His father's hands, once strong enough to hold a frightened team steady in rising water, trembled as they found the breast strap. There were small brass tags along the side. Caleb had seen them all his life. He had thought they marked repairs or team positions. One of them was green with age. Another was nearly worn smooth. Jonah touched the smallest tag. "Don't let them read the mud wrong twice," he whispered. Caleb leaned closer. Who read it wrong? Jonah's eyes moved toward the window, where the winter field lay flat and pale under frost. But he did not answer. By morning, he was gone. After the funeral, Hollow Bend did what towns often do when guilt has grown old enough to look like tradition. It sent pies. It sent cards. It sent men in clean coats to shake Caleb's hand and say his father had been complicated. Caleb thanked none of them for that word. Complicated was what people called a man when they wanted to avoid saying they had helped bury him. So Caleb kept the farm. He kept the mules. He kept the harness on the cleanest peg in the barn. He oiled it every spring and every fall. He replaced one stitch, then another. He polished the brass, but never too hard, afraid of rubbing away something his father's thumb had touched. And still, for all those years, he did not know what the tags meant. That was the shame Caleb never admitted. He had guarded the harness like evidence, but he had never learned how to read it. Caleb kept the harness where rain could not reach it. That was the first thing people noticed when they stepped into his barn. The roof leaked above the empty tack shelf. Dust gathered on the old grain scale, but the mule harness rested on the cleanest peg, under a strip of tin Caleb had nailed above it himself. To most visitors, that made no sense. The harness was too old for work and too plain for display. Its leather had gone dark from decades of oil. One breast strap bore 2 lines of hand stitching where Jonah had repaired it after a timber pull. The brass hames had dulled to the color of old cornmeal. Copper wire held one tug loop where a proper replacement should have been. Along the left side, near the breast strap, a row of small brass tags sat half-hidden under grime. Children thought they were pretty. Men thought they were useless. Willis Crane, Caleb's nearest neighbor, used to laugh whenever Caleb rubbed saddle soap into the cracked leather. "You know they sell tractors now," Willis said once. "Even used ones." Caleb kept working the oil into the seam. "A tractor don't feel the ground." "No," Willis said. "But it don't need feeding either." That was the kind of joke Hollow Bend liked. Soft enough to call friendly. Sharp enough to leave a mark. Caleb never answered those jokes the way people wanted him to. He did not defend the harness with long stories about Jonah. Those stories had become dangerous after East Draw, so Caleb let people laugh. He only kept the leather alive. Every spring, he took the harness down piece by piece. He checked the stitching with the pad of his thumb. He bent the leather slowly, listening for the dry crack that meant weakness. He cleaned each buckle with a rag, not enough to make it shine, only enough to keep it from freezing in its own corrosion. The brass tags he treated differently. He wiped around them, never hard across them. Maybe because Jonah had touched them on his deathbed. Maybe because the smallest tag had been under his father's finger when he whispered those last words. "Don't let them read the mud wrong twice." The tag itself carried marks Caleb had never been able to settle in his mind. Sutton, East Draw, 1957. Below that, almost too faint to see unless sunlight fell across the barn door at the right angle, there was a narrow slash and two smaller figures. Caleb had once thought they might be initials. Another time he thought they were repair dates. For years he told himself they were nothing important. But a man does not oil nothing for 60 years. The first person to ask the right question was not a grown man. It was Eli Turner. Eli was 12, skinny, restless, and always escaping his grandmother's house before supper. He came to Caleb's barn first because of the mules. Amos and Belle tolerated him in the careful way old animals tolerate lonely children. He brought them apple cores, then carrots, then questions. "What's that one for?" Eli asked one afternoon, pointing to the harness. "For pulling." "I know that." Eli stepped closer. "Why's it got numbers?" Caleb paused with a brush in his hand. Most folks asked why he kept the thing. Eli asked what it said. "That's just an old tag," Caleb told him. "What does R mean?" "Could mean rig." "What's East Draw?" The barn seemed to grow quieter around that question. Caleb put the brush down. "A place that floods. Grandma says our people used to live near East Draw." Caleb looked at the boy then. Turner. He had known the name, of course, but names in Hollow Bend could drift like seeds. He had not placed the child with the flood. Not until that moment. To keep the boy from asking more, Caleb lifted the harness and showed him the broad breast strap. "This here is where people misunderstand it." Eli frowned. "Looks like where it goes on the mule." "That's what happened," Caleb said, hearing Jonah in his own voice. "Not why." He carried the harness outside, where the pasture fell toward a wet patch near the sycamores. Caleb laid an old fence post in the mud, looped a line around it, and showed Eli how a straight pull dug deeper when the load had nowhere to rise. "Most men pull at what they want moved," Caleb said. "Your eyes lie to you that way." He changed the angle, ran the line through a low notch in a tree root, and shifted the pressure sideways before asking Amos to step. The post slid half an inch, clean and quiet. Eli's mouth opened. "That's it? That's the beginning of it." Again, Caleb reset the line. This time he made Eli watch the mud, not the post. The wet clay wrinkled on one side. Water squeezed up through grass on the other. The load moved when the pressure stopped fighting the deepest rut and began using the shallow one. By the third try, Eli was no longer watching the mule. He was watching the ground. That pleased Caleb more than he meant to show. A week later, Nolan Vance saw the same harness and saw nothing. At a county equipment demonstration, Caleb had brought Amos and Belle for the 4-H children. Nolan stood beside a polished excavator and nodded toward the mules. "I admire the history, Mr. Rusk, but we don't build rescue plans around nostalgia." Caleb ran one hand down Belle's neck. "No one asked you to." "That kind of traction had its day," Nolan said. "It still has its ground." A few men laughed, not loudly, just enough. That was the trouble with old knowledge. People liked it as decoration. They did not like it when it stood beside their machines and claimed to know something they had forgotten. Caleb took the mules home before the demonstration ended. That evening, He hung the harness back on the clean peg. The smallest brass tag turned in the last light from the barn door. Süden. East draw. 1957. He touched it once, then pulled his hand away. He still did not know how to read it. But 3 days later, when the clinic road began to slide, and the county crane sank into the same black clay Jonah had once understood, those numbers would stop being a private wound. They would become the first thing the wrong people wished Caleb had never kept. Nolan Vance did not ask Caleb for help. Not at first. He only stood there in the rain, staring at the old man, as if the mud had forced a thought into his mind that pride was still trying to throw away. Behind him, the crane engine idled hard. Its cables sagged in a wet curve. The transport van had stopped moving, but not in a way that comforted anyone. It leaned lower now, the rear corner nearly touching the ditch water. The woman inside had stopped screaming. That silence frightened Caleb more than the scream had. Marla Keene saw Nolan hesitate and stepped in before he could speak. "No," Nolan blinked. "I didn't say anything. You were about to." Marla pointed her clipboard toward Caleb. "We are not turning this into a circus because an old farmer brought livestock to a rescue. They're mules," Caleb said. "I don't care if they're angels," Marla snapped. "This is county property, county equipment, county liability." A few road workers laughed at that, grateful for permission. Nervous men often laughed when they did not know what else to do. Deputy Boone lifted the yellow tape and let it snap back. "You heard her, Caleb. Step back." Caleb looked past them all. He was not watching faces anymore. Faces lied when fear got into them. Mud did not. The crane had pulled straight from too high an angle, forcing the van's buried rear axle to carve deeper into the roadbed. The traction mats had floated because water was moving underneath them. Every new pull would make the van behave less like a vehicle and more like a stone in a river. "You've got water under the left mat," Caleb said. Nolan turned despite himself. "We trenched that side. You trenched where it showed, not where it's running." Pete Harlan, one of the road crew, frowned and looked down. His boot was half covered in clay water. "How would you know?" Caleb pointed with 2 fingers. "See that grass bending against the ditch? Water's coming underneath from the clinic side. Your crane's sitting on the wrong breadth of the hill." "Wrong breadth?" Deputy Boone laughed. Listen to him. But Nolan did not laugh that time. He looked at the grass, then at the crane tire, then at the water shining where it should have been dull. Marla noticed. "Nolan," he straightened quickly, "it doesn't change protocol." "No," Caleb said, "but it changes the pull." Marla stepped closer to him. She was younger than Caleb's daughter would have been if Caleb had married and had one, but she carried authority like a coat buttoned too tight. "Mr. Rusk, I respect that you may have experience with farm work, but if we let you interfere and someone dies, that is on this county." Caleb's eyes moved to the van. "If you keep pulling wrong and someone dies, what is that on?" The men around them went quiet. It was not a loud insult. It was worse. It was a true question. Sheriff Wade Mallory shifted his weight. Caleb could see the old man in him now, not the badge. The rain had flattened Wade's silver hair to his forehead, and his hand hovered near the radio clipped to his coat. "Caleb," Wade said, low enough that only those closest heard, "don't do this in front of everybody." "Do what?" "Make old ghosts part of a live rescue." Caleb looked at him. "They already are." Wade's mouth tightened. For 60 years, East Draw had lived in Hollow Bend like a locked room in a family house. Everyone knew where the door was. Nobody opened it. Caleb had spent most of his life standing outside that room, holding the one thing his father left him, not knowing whether it was a key or just another piece of wood from the door. Now, Wade looked afraid that the hinges were beginning to move. From the van, a paramedic shouted, "We need access on the rear side." Nolan turned. "Can you open it?" "Not with the tilt. If she drops another foot, we're climbing through the windshield." The daughter behind the tape began to sob again. "Please. Please. Somebody do something." Caleb took the harness off his shoulder and laid it across the hood of a county pickup. The sound of leather on wet metal made several men turn. Amos and Bell stood behind him, heads low, rain running down their gray faces. They did not toss or stamp. Old mules knew weather. They knew waiting. Caleb moved between them with the calm of a man setting a table before supper. He checked the breast strap. He checked the tug chains. He tested the copper-wired loop and felt it hold. Then he took the small brass tag between 2 fingers, not to read it, but to make sure it had not caught beneath the cracked leather. Deputy Boone shook his head. You really think those animals can outpull a crane? Caleb buckled Bell's collar. No. That answer caught Boone off guard. Caleb moved to Amos. A crane pulls harder. That's its problem. Pete Harlan gave a short, uncertain laugh. What's that supposed to mean? It means force ain't wisdom. Nolan heard that. The words hit him in the jaw, though Caleb had not aimed them there. Marla crossed her arms. This is absurd. No, Nolan said quietly. Everyone looked at him. He was staring at the mud again. Not at Caleb. Not at the mules. At the mud. What did you say about the sycamore? Nolan asked. Caleb did not smile. Root mass is wider than the trunk. It'll hold if you pull low and off-center. And the sled? Spreads the bite. Lets the van roll out of the rut instead of climbing straight up the wall of it. That roadbed won't take side load. It already is, Caleb said. You just haven't admitted it. Marla's face hardened. Nolan, absolutely not. The radio on Wade's shoulder cracked. A voice from inside the van broke through in pieces. Patient 2, breathing shallow, need extraction. That was the moment the argument changed. Not because anyone believed Caleb. Because the situation had made disbelief expensive. Nolan looked toward the van, then toward the crane, then back at Caleb's mules. His face carried the misery of a man being asked to choose between professional pride and the possibility that an old man was right. If this goes wrong, Marla said, it ends your career. Nolan swallowed. Caleb lifted the main line and looked at Sheriff Wade. I need the tape down. Wade did not move. For a second, Caleb thought the sheriff would choose the locked room again. Choose silence. Choose the old way Hollow Bend survived shame. Then Wade reached for the yellow tape and pulled it aside. One try, he said. Marla turned on him. Sheriff. One try, Wade repeated, louder now, so the crew and the cameras across the road could hear. And if Mr. Rusk tells you to move, you move. If he tells you to stand still, you stand still. We are past pride. Caleb stepped through the tape, with the harness in both hands. The rain fell harder. Behind him, someone muttered that Hollow Bend had finally lost its mind. Caleb did not turn around. He walked toward the mud, the van, the sinking crane, and the old wound waiting underneath all of it. For the first time that evening, the laughter did not follow him very far. Caleb did not walk straight to the van. That was the first thing Nolan noticed. Any other man would have gone toward the danger, toward the tilted vehicle, toward the patient voices trapped behind wet glass. Caleb went sideways. He stepped off the roadbed and into the weeds near the ditch, his boots sinking almost to the ankle. He crouched once, pressed 2 fingers into the clay, then stood and watched the water creep around his boot print. No one spoke. Even Marla Keene had stopped arguing for the moment, though her arms stayed folded tight against her raincoat. Caleb looked at the sycamore first. Not the trunk, but the ground around it. The roots had lifted the soil in long ribs, gripping the bank like old knuckles. He tapped one with his heel. Then he looked at the sled he had dragged behind the mules from his barn, a low, ugly thing made from oak runners and crossboards polished by decades of use. Pete Harlan stared at it. That's what you brought? Caleb nodded. That's what the mud needs. Nolan opened his mouth, then closed it again. Caleb handed him the end of a line. Run this low, under that root. Not around the trunk. Nolan frowned. A root can shear. Not that one. You don't know that. Caleb looked at him. Neither do you. For a second, rain was the only sound between them. Then Nolan took the line. That small act changed the whole scene. The younger road workers saw their engineer holding Caleb's rope, and something uncertain moved through them. It was not respect yet. It was not belief. It was the uneasy feeling men get when a plan they mocked begins to gather shape. Caleb worked without hurry. He set the sled at an angle between the van and the shallow rise near the sycamore. He did not tie the mules directly to the van. He ran the line through the root notch, across the sled, then down low to the harness so the pull would not lift, but roll. He adjusted Amos's collar, then Bell's, placing 2 fingers beneath the leather to check the fit. Why not pull from the front? Pete asked. Because the front ain't stuck. Pete looked embarrassed, but Caleb was not mocking him. He said it like a fact about weather. Nolan knelt near the rear tire and saw what Caleb meant. The van had not buried evenly. The rear axle had settled into a pocket where water was moving under the gravel. Pulling from the front had dragged the pocket deeper. A straight pull made sense on paper. In that mud, It had been a shovel. Nolan swallowed rainwater and pried together. "What do you need?" he asked. Caleb pointed. "Two boards under the right rear, but don't jam them. Let them float. One man on that side watching the ditch. Nobody touches the crane cable unless I say." Marla stepped forward. "Nolan, you are allowing an uncertified civilian to direct county personnel." Nolan did not look at her. "I'm allowing a man who understands the ground to stop a van from dropping." That sentence went through the crowd faster than thunder. Caleb heard it, but he gave no sign. Praise could distract a man as badly as insult. He clicked his tongue once to Amos and Bell. The mules leaned forward. Not hard, not yet. The harness tightened across their chests. Leather creaked. The brass tags trembled against the breast strap. Nothing happened. Deputy Boone gave a breathy little laugh, too quiet to be brave. Then Caleb lifted one hand. "Easy." The mules took another step. The sled shifted first. Its oak runners pressed into the wet road, spreading the force low and wide. Mud rose along its sides instead of swallowing it. The line through the sycamore root tightened at a sideways angle. The van groaned. The woman's daughter gasped behind the tape. The van did not come free, but it stopped sinking. That was the first miracle, though no one called it that. For almost 10 minutes, the van had been moving the wrong direction by inches. Down, sideways, toward the ditch. Now, under the old harness and the low pull, the rear corner held still. Rain hammered the roof. The crane engine idled. The paramedic inside shouted something, but his voice no longer carried the same panic. Nolan looked at the tension gauge on the crane cable. The number had dropped. He wiped rain from the glass and looked again. "How is that possible?" Pete said. Caleb kept his eyes on the mud. "Because it ain't fighting two pulls now." Nolan understood then. Not fully, but enough to feel his confidence crack open in a useful way. The crane had been pulling against the trapped axle while gravity and water pulled against the roadbed. Caleb had changed the argument. He had made the mud carry part of the load instead of steal all of it. "Slack the crane line," Nolan called. One of the operators hesitated. "Slack it," Nolan repeated. The cable loosened. The van did not drop. That silence was different from the silence after fear. This one had shape. The road crew stared at the old mules. Deputy Boone stared at the sled. Marla stared at Nolan as if betrayal wore a yellow rain shell. Sheriff Wade stared at the harness. And Eli Turner, who had slipped under the loose edge of the crowd, stared at the small brass tag bouncing near Bell's shoulder. He should not have been that close. No child should have been near a rescue line. But fear and curiosity had carried him where permission would not. Caleb saw him and snapped. "Back up." Eli did, but not before he read enough. "Mr. Rusk," the boy called, voice thin under the rain. "Why does that tag say East Draw?" The words struck harder than the cable had. Caleb's hand froze on the line. Nolan turned from the gauge. Marla frowned, not understanding why the name mattered. But Sheriff Wade understood. His face went pale beneath the rain, and for one brief moment he looked less like the law in Hollow Bend and more like a boy caught standing outside a room his family had sworn never to open. Caleb looked down at the tag. Air Sutton. East Draw. 1957. The van was still trapped. The patients were still waiting. The mud was still moving, but now something older had begun to move with it, and unlike the van, there would be no easy way to pull it back. The first patient came out through the rear door 6 inches at a time. No one cheered. The road was still failing, the van was still half-trapped, and the rain had not softened. But when Mr. Pruitt's stretcher cleared the rear frame, and the paramedics carried him across the boards, every man on that road understood something had changed. Caleb Rusk had not saved the van yet, but he had stopped the mud from taking it. Nolan Vance stood beside the crane with rain running down his face, watching the old mules breathe steam into the gray evening. 5 minutes earlier, he had been the engineer in charge of a failed rescue. Now he was holding Caleb's line in both hands, waiting for an old teamster to tell him when to move. That kind of humility did not come easy. "Again?" Nolan asked. Caleb looked at the rear tire, then at the ditch water. Not the same way. He shifted the sled 2 feet downslope. Pete Harlan helped without being told. Another road worker brought the boards Caleb asked for. No one laughed this time. They still did not understand the method, but they had seen enough to fear interrupting it. Caleb clicked softly to Amos and Bell. The mules leaned. Leather tightened. The line through the sycamore root drew low and steady. The van groaned. But this time, it did not twist toward the ditch. It rolled slightly, almost too small to notice, until the right rear tire found the boards and climbed half an inch out of the rut. "Hold," Caleb said. Nolan lifted his hand. "Hold." The crew froze. Inside the van, the second patient was still strapped near the front, but the angle had improved enough for the paramedic to reach her without crawling over broken equipment. Marla Keene exhaled as if she had been holding her breath for 10 minutes and hated Caleb for proving it. Sheriff Wade Mallory did not look at the van. He looked at the harness. The small brass tag Eli had read was visible now, swinging against the wet leather near Bell's shoulder. Each time the mule shifted, the tag turned and caught the floodlight. Air Sutton, East Draw, 1957. Nolan saw it too. At first, he looked only because Eli had said the words aloud. Then his expression changed. He stepped closer, squinting through the rain. "Mr. Rusk," he said, "what does R17 mean?" Caleb kept his hand on the line. "It means keep your eyes on the van. I'm asking because I've seen marks like that." Caleb turned slowly. Nolan pointed, not touching the harness. "Route codes. Old emergency maps used them before county numbering changed. R could mean rescue line or ridge route." Caleb's jaw tightened. "That tag belonged to my father. I understand." "No," Caleb said. "You don't." The old anger came faster than he expected. It rose out of places he thought age had cooled. Suddenly, Nolan was not just a young engineer in a rain shell. He was every man who had read that county report and believed it. Every boy at school who had asked if Jonah Rusk saved flour sacks while people drowned. Every clean-coated neighbor who had called his father complicated after the funeral. Caleb stepped between Nolan and the harness. "You got your rescue," he said. "Leave the dead alone." Nolan did not back away. "I'm not trying to insult him. You already did that before the rain got hard." The words landed. Nolan looked down. For a moment, the rescue scene around them blurred into motion. Paramedics calling to each other, Pete dragging another board, deputies keeping the crowd behind the tape. But between Caleb and Nolan, everything narrowed to the tag. Then Nolan spoke more quietly. "When I interned at the county office, I helped scan old flood maps. East Draw had route numbers. R11, R14, R21. I remember because half the pages were damaged." Caleb stared at him. Nolan looked again at the brass. "But I don't remember R17. That was 60 years ago." "I know. Then, maybe you remember wrong." "Maybe," Nolan swallowed. "But if I don't, that means this tag records a route that never made it into the public report." The rain seemed to strike harder. Caleb felt the line in his hand, but no longer felt the weight of it. R17, East Draw, 1957. For years he had seen those marks and refused to name them. Repair numbers, harness positions, team notes, anything but what Jonah had tried to leave behind. Not until he knows how to read it. His mother's whisper came back first, then Jonah's. "Don't let them read the mud wrong twice." Sheriff Wade took one step back. It was a small movement, but Caleb saw it. Wade's face had gone stiff, and the old sheriff was no longer watching Nolan like a man concerned about rescue protocol. He was watching him like a man who had just heard a locked drawer open. Marla noticed too. "What are you two talking about?" she demanded. Nolan did not answer her right away. He kept his eyes on the brass tag. "I think this harness may have recorded a rescue line from East Draw." Marla's expression sharpened. "This is not the time." "No," Nolan said. "That's what bothers me." Caleb looked at him. Nolan finally met his eyes. There was no mockery in them now, no professional annoyance. Only the sick recognition of a man realizing that a mistake in the present had led him to an older one. "If your father marked R17, Nolan said, then the report may not have told the whole story." The second patient was lifted from the van just as he said it. Behind them, the crew called out in relief. A stretcher rolled through the mud. The daughter behind the tape began crying again, but differently this time. The living had been pulled free, but the dead were not done with that road. And before the county could pack up its lights, Caleb knew one thing with a fear deeper than pride. Someone was going to try to bury R17 all over again. The rescue ended before the argument did. The second patient was carried across the boards and lifted into an ambulance that had finally reached the high side of Mercy Ridge Road. The van still sat half-buried, the crane still leaned with mud up its wheels, and the county lights still burned against the rain. But once the living were safe, the people in charge began doing what people in charge often did. They began deciding what the story had been. Marla Keene stood beside a county pickup with her phone pressed to her ear, speaking in a clipped voice. Successful extraction. 2 patients transported. County rescue personnel stabilized the vehicle. We had limited assistance from a local resident. Caleb heard that part. Limited assistance. He was coiling the wet line beside Amos and Belle. His hands moved slowly because the arthritis had stiffened in the rain, but he did not look up. He had lived long enough to know that a lie rarely arrived wearing dirty boots. Usually, it came polished and official. Nolan heard it too. He turned toward Marla. That's not what happened. Marla lowered the phone. It is exactly what happened in language that protects this office. That old man stopped the van from rolling, and county personnel completed the extraction. With his rigging, with our scene control, Nolan stared at her as if he were finally seeing a second problem beneath the first. This is why reports go bad. Marla's eyes narrowed. Choose your words carefully. I am. Caleb looked up then. Nolan walked toward him through the mud, holding his phone in one hand. Mr. Rusk, I need photographs of those tags. Caleb's fingers tightened around the line. Need? To compare them with the flood archive. Marla stepped in fast. No evidence is being collected at this scene. Nolan did not turn. It's not county evidence yet. Exactly, she said. And unless you want to create a legal issue out of a rescue that just ended well, you will stop. The word well sat wrong in the rain. It had ended well for the patients. Not for the truth. Sheriff Wade Mallory came close enough that his voice could stay low. Caleb, take your team home. Caleb kept coiling. You worried about the mules catching cold? I'm worried about you. That's so? Wade glanced toward Nolan, then toward Marla, then back at Caleb. Some things get worse when men dig them up. Caleb gave a humorless breath. Mud does that too. I mean it. Wade's voice roughened. East Draw ruined your father's life. Don't let it take what you've got left. Caleb looked at him. What do I have left, Wade? The sheriff had no answer ready. That was when the stranger arrived. He had been standing near the news van on the far side of the road, dry under a black umbrella, while everyone else looked soaked and common. He wore a wool coat too fine for a mudslide, and his shoes had not touched the worst of the clay. Caleb noticed men like that. They did not belong near trouble unless trouble had value. Mr. Rusk? The man asked. Caleb did not answer. The man smiled anyway. Martin Sloan. I collect regional agricultural history, harness work, draft equipment, early rescue tools. I must say, what you did tonight was extraordinary. Nolan frowned. This is not a good time. I'll be brief. Sloan reached into his coat and drew out a business card, holding it between 2 fingers as if offering something clean in a dirty world. I would like to purchase the harness. Caleb stared at him. Marla looked relieved for half a second, then hid it. Sloan continued. Not as a novelty, as preservation. Too many items like that rot in barns until no one remembers what they were. Caleb looked down at the leather in his hands. People remembered enough to laugh at it. A shame, Sloan said smoothly. I can offer $8,000 tonight. Pete Harlan, standing nearby, let out a low whistle. $8,000 was not a fortune to men like Sloan. To Caleb, it was a year of property tax, 2 winter fuel bills, and the blood pressure medication he had been cutting in half since March because the bottle needed to last. Sloan saw the silence and raised the blade. $12,000, he said. Cashier's check tomorrow. You keep the animals. I only want the harness. Nolan stepped closer. Why that fast? Sloan's smile thinned. Because I know value when I see it. No, Nolan said. You knew which object to ask for. For the first time, Sloan looked at him instead of through him. Caleb felt the rain running down the back of his neck. $12,000 could keep the county from placing a lien on his pasture. It could buy hay. It could pay the clinic bill he had ignored in a drawer. It could let an old man stop fighting every small bill with smaller checks. All he had to do was hand over the thing nobody had wanted until it began to speak. Eli Turner stood near Amos, one hand on the mule's wet shoulder. He had no business being there, but nobody moved him away. Mr. Rusk, Eli asked. Is he buying the harness because it's old or because it tells something? The question landed where the money could not reach. Caleb looked at the boy, then at Nolan, then at Sheriff Wade, whose face had folded in on itself. Last, he looked at Marla Keene, who was pretending not to hope he would take the offer. Caleb slid the brass tag under his thumb. Sutton, East Draw, 1957. I've sold hay, he said. I've sold calves. I've sold a good saddle once when winter got mean. Sloane waited. Caleb lifted the harness and laid it across Belle's back. But I don't sell what I don't understand. The collector's face went still. Nolan exhaled. Marla turned away, already reaching for her phone again, and Sheriff Wade closed his eyes like a man who had just heard the first board crack on a door he had spent his whole life keeping shut. By morning, Caleb knew, people would come for the harness in cleaner ways. Forms, requests, offers, warnings. So before the county could write another report, he would have to learn what his father had written in brass. Nolan came to Caleb's barn after midnight. He did not come in a county truck. He came in his own pickup, with mud still dried along the doors and a folder tucked under his jacket to keep the rain off it. Caleb saw the headlights sweep across the pasture and almost reached for the old shotgun he no longer loaded. Then he saw Eli Turner climb out of the passenger side. The boy carried a Bible wrapped in a towel. Caleb opened the barn door before they knocked. "If Marla sent you," he said, "you can both turn around." Nolan shook his head. "Marla doesn't know I'm here. That's supposed to comfort me?" "No." Nolan held up the folder. "But this might tell us what R17 means." They laid everything on the workbench beneath a hanging bulb. The harness rested beside them, dark and still. The brass tags turned upward for the first time, as if they had been waiting years to face the light. Nolan spread out copied flood maps and brittle-looking report scans. "These are from the county archive. Most of the original East Draw file was damaged, but route numbers show up in dispatch notes." He pointed to one page. R11, R14, RN02. Caleb looked at the harness. Those same numbers sat on the brass tags, not in perfect order, but close enough to make his mouth go dry. Nolan touched the paper, not the harness. R11 was the North Mill Road. R14 was the church rise. R21 was the old bridge approach. Caleb's voice came rough. "And R17? Nolan looked at him. "Missing." The word did not sound big enough for what it did. Eli stepped forward and unwrapped the Bible. "My grandma said I could bring this if I kept it dry." Caleb knew the Turner family Bible by sight. Old black cover, cracked spine, gold letters nearly gone. Eli opened it to the births and deaths pages, then to a folded sheet pressed between them. "My great-grandmother wrote this," he said. "She was a girl in the flood." The handwriting was thin, but readable. Caleb leaned over it. "Rain all night. Water at porch. Rusk came after midnight with team. Took Mama and the babies first. Said he would come back for Uncle Ray. He did come back. I saw his lantern." Caleb had to grip the edge of the bench. For 60 years, the report had said Jonah abandoned East Draw. But a girl who had lived through it wrote that he came back. Nolan turned another page from the archive. "The public report says Jonah diverted to recover a supply wagon at 1240. Eli shook his head. "That Bible says he took people." Nolan nodded slowly. "And the dispatch notes show a county barricade was placed at South Cut Road at midnight. That was supposed to be the escape route." Caleb looked up. "Supposed to be?" Nolan's face hardened. "They closed the wrong road." The barn went quiet except for the rain ticking against the roof. Piece by piece, the story changed shape. Jonah had not left East Draw to save flour or tools or feed. He had pulled families out along routes the official report never listed. R11, R14, R17, R21. Each tag was not decoration. It was a mark of where the team had gone, where the harness had worked, where Jonah had tied a line and pulled somebody through water that should have killed them. But the deeper truth did not come clean. Nolan found it in a deputy's handwritten note at the bottom of a scan. 3 persons remained beyond lower crossing. Rusk advised route unsafe. Chose return with loaded family wagon. Further attempt impossible after bank loss. Caleb read it once, then again. His throat tightened. He left them. Eli looked frightened. Nolan did not answer quickly. He chose not to take the team back across a bank that was already breaking. He left them. Caleb repeated, softer this time. He had a wagon full of living people, Nolan said. If he turned back, maybe he saved 3. Maybe he lost 10. Maybe he lost the team and nobody got out. Caleb stepped away from the bench. For most of his life, he had wanted one simple sentence. My father was innocent. Now the truth had arrived carrying mud on both boots. Jonah Rusk had gone back. He had saved people. He had been braver than the report said. But he had also made a choice no son wanted to inherit. To leave some because saving them might doom the rest. And the county had taken that terrible choice, stripped away the rescues around it, and left only the ugliest piece behind. Nolan placed one final paper on the bench. This memo was never in the public file. Caleb bent over it. County closure of South Cut contributed to delay. Avoid liability language in final report. Attribute failed East Draw recovery to private teamster judgment. Private teamster. Not Jonah, not father, not husband. Just a useful place to put blame. Eli's small voice broke the silence. So they made him carry it? Caleb looked at the harness. At the brass tags, his father had touched before dying. At the marks, Caleb had guarded but never read. Yes, he said. They made him carry what belonged to them. Nolan closed the folder. There has to be an independent review. Caleb gave a tired laugh. You think Marla Keene is going to open this because you ask politely? No. From the doorway, Sheriff Wade Mallory answered for him. Caleb turned. Wade stood in the rain outside the barn, hat in hand, face hollow with something older than guilt. She won't, Wade said. But I have something my father left. Caleb stared at him. The locked room had opened. And this time, Wade was holding the key. Sheriff Wade Mallory did not step into Caleb's barn right away. He stood under the edge of the roof with rain dripping from his hat, holding a yellowed envelope between both hands. Caleb recognized the look on his face. It was the look of a man carrying something heavier than paper. My father left this in his gun locker, Wade said. Nolan looked at the envelope. A statement? Wade nodded. He was a deputy the night of East Draw. Caleb felt his chest tighten. And you knew? I knew there was something. Wade's voice broke low. I was afraid to read it. Then I was afraid because I had. No one spoke. Wade handed the envelope to Caleb, not Nolan. That mattered. For once, the truth was not being passed around above Caleb's head. The next evening, the county meeting room filled past the last row. People came because of the rescue. They stayed because word had already spread that the old Rusk harness had numbers on it, that the East Draw report might have been wrong, that Sheriff Wade had brought an envelope nobody had seen before. Marla Keene sat at the front table with a folder squared neatly before her. This meeting concerns the Mercy Ridge rescue response, she said. It is not a historical hearing. Caleb stood from the second row. No, he said. It's both. Marla's mouth tightened. Mr. Rusk. Public comment will come after official statements. Caleb walked to the front anyway. He carried the harness in both hands, not over his shoulder this time, not like a burden, like a witness. The room changed when he laid it across the table. Leather, brass, mud stains, old stitching, copper repair wire, all of it under fluorescent lights that made everything look plainer and less able to hide. Men who had laughed at that harness the night before looked down at their boots. Caleb touched the first tag. R11, he said. North Mill Road. Nolan placed a scanned dispatch note beside it. Caleb touched the next. R14, Church Rise. Another note. R21, Old Bridge Approach. The room was silent now. Then Caleb touched the smallest tag. R17, East Draw. Marla looked at Nolan. These documents have not been authenticated. Nolan did not sit down. Then authenticate them. Open the file. You are not authorized to demand, I am the engineer of record on the Mercy Ridge incident, Nolan said. His voice shook once, then steadied. And I am submitting a formal safety and records concern. If a past flood report was altered to hide a road closure error, then current emergency planning may still be based on bad assumptions. That changed the room, not because everyone cared about old guilt, because everyone understood current danger. Eli Turner stepped forward before his grandmother could stop him. The family Bible looked too large in his arms. My great-grandmother wrote this, he said. His voice was small, but it carried. He read the line slowly. Rusk came after midnight with team, took Mama and the babies first, said he would come back for Uncle Ray. He did come back. I saw his lantern. An old woman in the third row covered her face. Someone whispered the Turner name. Then Wade rose. He did not wear his hat. Caleb noticed that. Wade had never taken his hat off in a county room unless someone had died. "My father was Deputy Mallory," he said. "He signed off on road closure logs that night. He also left this." He opened the envelope with hands that made no attempt to hide their trembling. The note inside was short. Wade read it aloud. Jonah Rusk returned to East Draw after the first wagon. Southcutt Road was closed in error. Final report placed judgment failure on Rusk to prevent liability against the county office. "I did not stop it. I should have." No one moved. Wade folded the note once. "My father wrote that, but I kept it locked away after I found it, so if apologies are being counted, mine comes late." He turned to Caleb. "I am sorry," Wade said. "Not for my father only, for myself." Caleb looked at him a long time. An apology could not give Jonah back his name. Not fully. It could not return Elsie's quiet years, or Caleb's schoolroom shame, or the jobs Jonah never got again. But Wade had not brought only words. He had brought the key. Marla's face had gone pale in the official way people go pale when paper turns against them. "This will require legal review," she said. "Yes," Nolan answered. "Independent legal review. And until then," Wade added, "the East Draw file will be preserved. No removals, no private transfers." At the back of the room, Martin Sloan stood and slipped toward the door. Pete Harlan blocked him without saying a word. That was the first time Caleb saw Hollowbend do something before being told. Not cheer, not clap, just stand in the way of a man who wanted to carry the past out quietly. By the end of the meeting, Marla had agreed to reopen the flood file under public record request. Nolan had signed his name to the review demand. Wade had surrendered his father's note. Eli's Bible was photographed, then returned to his hands, and Caleb walked out with the harness. Not cleared of pain, not rewarded, only lighter by the weight of one lie. Outside, the rain had stopped. The mud remained, but for the first time in 60 years, Hollowbend had begun to look at it instead of looking away. By early spring, Mercy Ridge Road no longer looked like the place where a van had nearly disappeared. The county rebuilt the failing stretch with stone, drainage tile, and a lower pullout near the sycamore. Nolan Vance oversaw the work himself. He still brought survey markers, soil reports, and engineering diagrams, but he also walked the ditch before every decision, looking for bent grass, water shine, and the soft breathing places under clay. Caleb never said Nolan had learned. He did not need to. One morning, Nolan stood beside the new shoulder and told Pete Harlan, "Don't fight the slope. Let the water tell you where it wants to go." Pete looked across the road at Caleb, who was leaning against the fence with Amos and Belle behind him. Caleb only nodded once. The East Draw review did not end quickly. Things tied up by county paper rarely did. Lawyers asked for extensions. Marla Keene was moved from emergency communications to records compliance, which sounded like a punishment written by someone trying not to admit it was one. Martin Sloan's private collection came under inquiry after 3 families reported flood objects missing from estate sales. Sheriff Wade Mallory submitted his father's note to the review board, then announced he would not run again. No speech? No grand confession. Just a folded statement, a date, and a man finally refusing to let silence be inherited. The Hollowbend Gazette printed Jonah Rusk's name on the front page for the first time in 60 years, without the word failure near it. Caleb bought 3 copies. One went into the kitchen drawer. One went to Eli Turner's grandmother. One he folded and placed beneath the tin strip above the clean peg in the barn. Not as proof for himself. He no longer needed proof in quite the same way. The review board asked to take the entire harness into evidence. Caleb refused at first, then listened when Nolan explained what they actually needed. In the end, the smallest brass tag R17, East Draw, 1957 was photographed, cataloged, and temporarily sealed in a county evidence file. The rest of the harness came home. People said it should go behind glass. A historical society woman offered to display it with a printed panel and a tasteful light. Caleb thanked her, then closed the barn door halfway so the conversation would understand it was over. "That harness has already spent enough time being looked at wrong," he told Eli. So on Saturdays, the boy came to the barn. He learned saddle soap first. Not because it was dramatic, but because leather that is not cared for will betray a man at the worst moment. Caleb made him clean buckles, check stitches, and feel along each strap with his thumb. "Don't trust what looks strong," Caleb said. Trust what holds under your hand. Eli nodded like he understood. He did not fully. That was all right. Caleb had been 10 once too. By April, Eli could set the breast strap without pinching Belle's shoulder. By May, he could tell when Amos was leaning before the line tightened. By June, Caleb took him to the wet pasture after a night of rain and laid an old fence post in the mud. "Move it," Caleb said. Eli ran the line too high the first time. The post dug deeper. Caleb did not scold him. He only waited. The second time, Eli watched the grass. He saw water shine along the lower rut. He moved the line to the sycamore root, set the sled at an angle, and spoke to Belle softly enough that the mule turned one ear back to listen. The post slid free. Eli smiled before he could stop himself. Caleb looked away, pretending to check the knot. The truth about Jonah Rusk would never be as simple as Caleb had wanted. His father had saved people. His father had lost people. His father had been blamed for what the county had done, and also haunted by what no man could undo. But Caleb understood something now that anger had hidden from him for years. A good name was not the same as a perfect story. Sometimes a name was restored not by removing the mud, but by showing where the mud had really been. Late that afternoon, Caleb rehung the harness in the barn. But he did not place it back on the highest peg. He set a new peg lower, near the workbench, where Eli could reach it without asking. Outside, the road to Mercy Ridge dried under a pale sky. Amos and Belle stood in the pasture, tails flicking at flies. Somewhere beyond the trees, water moved quietly through the new ditch, taking the path it should have been given years before. Eli touched the harness once before leaving. "Mr. Rusk?" Caleb turned. "You always say not to pull against the mud." Caleb waited. Eli looked at the wet field, then at the old leather. "Pull with it." For the first time in a long while, Caleb smiled without pain getting in the way. The old harness had been called useless once. Caleb never corrected them again. He only taught the boy how to make it work.